Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another installment of The Brew. I'm your host, Dr. Gianmichael Salvato, and I believe that my co-host, Raphael Rey, will be here any minute. I actually see Raphael's icon down here, so maybe you're having some trouble getting in, brother. If that's the case, we'll see you when you get here. Guys, I'm excited about today's program because, as we've talked about over the past several weeks, we've spoken about the witch wars, the lines drawn in the sand, dividing so many in our community, and looking for ways forward. And I think one of the ways that we can begin to build that way forward and strengthen our own practice along the way would be to start to look at what our sacred stories are and the role that they play in our practice. And when we begin to learn another's story instead of only our own, for my experience has been that a deepening of my own awareness occurs in my practice, and a broadening understanding of the singularity that exists beneath it all starts to come to the fore as well. And for me personally, that enriches my practice. For me personally, that is the path to building dialogue itself. And we've seen this outside of the pagan world, as back in the 60s, as Thomas Merton and Thich Nhat Hanh began an earnest dialogue between Catholics and Buddhists, particularly contemplative Catholics and contemplative Buddhist contemplatives. And so today, the reason I'm so excited is that we've got a special guest with us that I'm going to bring into the studio right now, who has over 20 years experience as a practitioner, as a pagan practitioner. I'll let him tell you a little bit about the path or paths that's involved. But who also brings with him the academic background and the theological background, and years of study to really understand not just his own mythos, but the mythos that we find in the pagan world in general. And so we're going to talk about that today. And I always like to start off, before I welcome the guest, reminding you guys that you are part of this conversation. And so your comments, your questions, your insights that you might offer in the comment section here, whether we're live or you're watching on the rebroadcast, we keep the conversation going. Every single week, about 600 people tune in and watch this over the course of the week. And so we're grateful for your participation, because that's where that dialogue building, that's where that bridge building really occurs. So let me welcome to the show today Richard Levy. Or I'm not sure that's how we Jews on this side of the pond pronounce it. I don't know. I should have asked you if it was Levy or Levi, but I'll let you correct me in a second there. Welcome to the show, and tell us a little bit about your background. Tell us, what as much as you'd like about your path, and about what led you even to academically study the theology and philosophy that you bring to the table.
It's pardon me, it's Levy.
Okay.
Just to start, which is fine though. So, oh god, I mean, I mostly got through exploring this sort of an idiot and making mistakes. But I definitely would say I very much just had a calling. I think most people do. I think we consider the rationale as to what explore it, and it's often people talk about things like spiritual development and power, whatever else. But actually, most of the time, it's a calling. We just don't really that anymore, because we start putting a lot of vocabulary behind it. But the truest form of it, when it's just a calling and it's something you just is in your blood, it's within you, you just express it. I wouldn't say I particularly have a tradition. To some people that I know that feels quite weak, to others not so much. It is what it is. I explored various things. I met various people from various traditions and heard them all out, and I don't have a problem with tradition. It's just I prefer to work the way I would put it as I went through learning more and practicing more. It's very much about just using the raw materials, and then you start to see how those practices use those raw materials, and then certainly give it different forms and different scope depending on the culture and the background, and then that forms traditions, which is fine because you need that. You need a language, otherwise, there's no way of communication without that language. As for the academic side, I mean, I wouldn't say I did philosophy and theology, and I was always interested in those subjects, so I studied them. And of course, the thing which I love with philosophy is its origins are in discussion. When you read something like Plato's Republic, it's a book about a discussion that these philosophers had. What we're doing now is kind of that. And when I give talks and get people discussing things and things like that, it brings it out. And the other thing I do also through the Centre for Pagan Studies that I work for is storytelling, obviously, as your subject addresses. Ooh, I have lost sound. No.
Sorry, I forgot. In order to make your sound better, I have to mute my microphone, and that boosts the signal. So if you ever hear me breaking up, just mute your microphone on the screen. And I apologize, guys, that I forgot. I was just saying how much I really enjoy and appreciate your story. It's one of the things I like best about this program is that I get to sort of be the beneficiary of so many people's personal stories, that it just broadens and deepens my appreciation for the LGBTQ, pagan, and witchcraft world. For our worldview, our ethos, it just really makes a big difference for me. The more stories that I hear, because it gives me perspectives that I would not otherwise have held. So let's talk about because I've got a similar background in theological anthropology, understanding the roles of stories and mythos, understanding the types of roles or characters, archetypes within those mythos, really was a game changer for me as a 20-year-old in a college student. And it really made the light go on in my head that if my spiritual journey was to be meaningful in any way, it had to broaden. It had to have perspectives outside of my own, so that I could identify those archetypes within my mythos, and then see the connection between those and everyone else. Otherwise, I wasn't being faithful to my oath or vows or lifestyle or calling, as you put it, as a witch. As a young witch, 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, it was just all about what everybody was telling me. And I'm really mindful in our tradition at 6, the grandmother or the aunt in our case sits at the hearth and shares the stories. And there's almost a curriculum within Svegaria that the stories begin in a way that is at first entertaining for the 6-year-old, and the 7-year-olds maybe add a little more layers of meaning at 7 and 8. But by the time the child is ready to turn 13, just as the other tradition for my heritage spiritually, at that age, then they're able to hear the real story, the truest and deepest metaphysical meanings. And in the Jewish tradition, the same sorts of things occur, as just one example of how our storytelling evolved. Richard, what are your insights or your key reflections about the importance of storytelling in the pagan tradition, as well as the meaning of understanding those archetypes? I don't know if you saw the episode I did of Inner Alchemy last week, where I talk about how each of those archetypes in the mythos that make up my heritage, how I identify with them and what that calls me to. I don't know if you saw that, but just give us your take on it.
It's interesting. I think we once did say to each other, we're talking about it being the first form of, and of course, not only in terms of history, but in terms of, like you said, the first thing that you experienced was being told stories. Now, whilst most people might not have that in a traditional way, most kids, I know my age even, were told a bedtime story. Even if you don't have that, a lot of the time you'll get that from school, or you'll get that from church or synagogue, however you're raised. And the thing that ends up happening is that stays with you, and then you get older, and if you get interested in magic or paganism, you explore the myths, you explore stories. But more important, actually, what you end up doing is moving away from that a lot of time. People start reading occult texts and things like that, and it's easy to forget that you already know more magic than you realise because of all those stories. Now, when it comes from a religion, often, and I went through this myself, we go through that phase of, I don't like religion anymore, I've turned to paganism because religion.
Let me stop you before you get to that point, because I think what you just said was really important, and I couldn't interrupt you right at the right spot because again I had my mic off. But go back to explaining your perspective on that idea that when people reach that stage where they begin to look at the occult, many times they don't realize how much magic they already know.
Yeah, because if you were taught the fairy tales from the Brothers Grimm to what Andrew Lang collected in the Yellow, Red, etc. book of fairy tales, if you liked your mythology growing up, it's all in that. And you can find so much in that I would generally say that if you have a decent book of fairy tales and a decent book on mythology, or even a Bible or anything like that, you kind of have your first magic book, if you like, your first spell book, if you want. It's all in there. So, as a quick example, a friend of mine who's from the Hoodoo tradition, we were talking once about stories, and it was easy to find a very common language in them, and we were very much exploring certain ones, and one of them we looked at was Red Riding Hood, and we were going through loads of the magic in it, and then I started to laugh, and she asked me why I was laughing, and I said, because we're both stupid. We have both ignored one of the most key features, which is in the very title, which is the colour red. We've discussed the wolf, we've discussed the grammar, we didn't discuss yet the colour red, which is in the title and right there. And of course, when you look at most magic, but Hoodoo particularly, a lot works with colour. Colour is used for many things and is a vocabulary for many things. And of course, in Hoodoo, it's well known because, of course, I know a lot of people practice candle magic this way, of course, but Hoodoo does as well, where the candle colour is significant. So we started to discuss that afterwards. But again, if you've read Red Riding Hood, if you've read Sleeping Beauty, as much as I'm hesitant to say it's going to be quite as good if you grow up on early Disney stuff even, there's key parts in there. And often I find that when you talk to people practicing, whilst they might, Disney isn't quite the same thing, but certainly there's enough elements there that kind of gets you interested. So maybe you'll read what they're based on and go from that point. But of course, particularly when you look at the stuff from the Brothers Grimm, these were these were, a lot of them were stories of the land of Germany, of the Black Forest, and then Andrew Lang's stuff was of different parts of the world where he collected. If you look at the Arabian Nights, a lot of people in certain... so a friend of mine, she's Egyptian, and she does speak. She tells stories of the Arabian Nights. I don't do the nights myself because they're very complicated and I would want to know them a lot better than I do. But back in Egypt, she told me that people would be mouthing the story along with her. These are things that people knew really well and they knew where it was going. And all contain things about the history of the place, things about the culture, things about psychology, all that stuff. But also, there's the mystical, the magical. That's all in there. So if you learn to see it that way, and I will say, this psychology is a difficult subject matter because psychology is very, very has a place. Don't get me wrong, but modern psychology has this big thing of sort of putting so much of consciousness just in the mind alone and ignoring some of the connections it has, that it can get lost. But there is definitely a magical part, and once you start seeing that, it changes everything. So if you look at a famous one, let's look at Genesis, because everyone knows the story of the creation. If you look at the creation of man, what we find in Eden are 4 rivers flowing into this garden. So the garden is a temple, 4 rivers, 4 directions. Most people work with directional magic. You have a priestess and a priest, Adam and Eve. The priest tends the land, speaks to the animals, has this relationship with the garden. The priestess has a direct relationship with the goddess through the tree. The serpent, the tree, all related to what at the time was the Canaanite goddess Asherah, which also has links to various things, including Hathor in Egyptian mythology. You start to see these patterns, and that's really when you can, as a result, because you start sharing these patterns with other practitioners, they recognize it in what they are aware of. And then you start to have interesting conversations. You start to realize that sometimes you might have better methods or techniques than the other one, and you'll learn from that, or they'll learn from you. Sometimes they're equally as good, and that's fine as well. It just broadens your understanding. And other times it just helps create a connection. It just helps create an understanding. And you don't have to get too caught up in the dress-up side and even the culture side, because that, again, all has its place. But in many ways, the magical transcends all of that.
That's absolutely brilliant, and I thank you for that, because it resonates with and matches my personal story in many regards. Because when I started to reach out and listen to those other people's stories, one of the first things that happened for me, and I was still in seminary at the time, so roughly around 18, 19 years old, it dawned on me that if these stories, if we really listen to the stories, the point you made about being able to draw the connections, not only happens to draw the connections, draw us into a focus on our own story and seeing where the layers of meaning are there, but it also drew like immediate lines and connections between the stories of what Christians call the Old Testament and what they call the New Testament. It was interesting to me that because they both arose out of the same culture, the archetypes were similar. So there was the direct line between the character of Yeshua in the New Testament with Moses in the Old Testament. There was a direct correlation on so many levels that we could see it was the same story being repackaged and told again for the same midrashic purpose. And that was the eye opener for me, was that if my tradition that I was raised with had those sorts of midrashic tales, repeating older midrashic tales, then I said, well, let's go and see if there's a correlation between the Pentateuch and the between Torah stories and between Egyptian mythos, which I was studying at the time in school. And sure enough, there were parallels. And then in my journey, I don't know if this has happened to you, but in my journey, my whole life as a hereditary witch, I recognize that no matter what tradition I start to study, if I see a picture of a deity from another culture, it's always been a point of fascination and delight for me that the ones that I'm drawn to are always the same mythos behind them. Whether it's Kali or Hecate or Ereshkigal or the Black Madonna, it's always the same characters that draw me. And does that happen to you?
I've never really thought about it. I mean, I suppose probably to a point. I think for me, it's more this thing of, I guess, yeah, it's difficult because there's a part of it that's obviously there's a magical draw, and then there's just a human draw, and I love those sort of fierce, sort of powers that you're talking about. But equally, I suppose I would say that I don't know, you never know where you're going to get drawn. And but yeah, I do see your point. Absolutely, you do end up. It's, I suppose, again, it's just because what you're drawn to is the power you're working with. So then the form that power takes can vary.
Absolutely. Well, if you guys are watching this live, we would love to hear from you and would love your comments. What role do, if any, do sacred stories have in your tradition? And let us, share with us if you like what your tradition is, and we will we'll share those here on the air while we're here. I have a sense that there might be some technical problems going on because of the just the numbers that I'm seeing in terms of viewers. And normally we have a lot more comments coming in through the show. Those don't seem to be coming in today. So I sense there might be some problems there. But I see that we've had a couple more people just jump in, and today we are talking about the role that stories play in our spiritual journey as LGBTQ pagans and witches and mages and such, and we've shared a little bit about how those archetypes are easily identifiable many times in the different traditions, and Richard pointed out how even the person who's never been exposed to the recognized or canonical pagan stories has actually been exposed to magic and witchcraft through the fairy tales that we hear as children. And so we've been, for many of us, we can look back and say, aha, I've been studying and preparing for this moment right now my whole life. Some might argue that everybody in everyone on the planet is preparing for this moment their entire life. That's the purpose of the journey. But it's nice to have those identifiable milestones and say, yeah, when I saw the sorcerer, this is a true story, when I saw the Sorcerer's Apprentice for the first time, I recognized that that's what I was, and that the sorcerer, in my case that I was apprenticing under, was my aunt. And that my family were sort of the played some of those roles in that cartoon. I was like, aha, yeah, that's the one that cleans up, that's the one that does this, that's the one that does that. And so even those stories as children help to both inform and identify who we are, I think, today. And so if there's no comments, I just want to encourage everybody, if you're watching on the replay, I know that a lot of people in the United States right now, Richard, are watching the television because there is some explosive testimony going on, revealing and exposing some of the more malign and felonious activities of the current occupant of the Oval Office, Kremlin operative Donald Trump. So I know that a lot of folks are watching that and watching the testimony, and I was watching it right up until the minute we went live, and have it actually on the screen still in front of me with closed captions going. So when you're watching this on the replay, if I look a little distracted at times, it's just because something will flash up on the screen and it just catches my eye for a moment. But I promise you, I've been present here. This is a conversation I know that you and I, Richard, will continue personally, privately, and probably for years, because it's something that's such a passion for both of us, such a common interest, and will always be a point of fascination for me. But Tyre, Tom, and let's see, and all of you that are watching this live, as well as those watching it in the comments, please share with us a little bit about what your tradition is and how stories, sacred stories, mythos, legends, if you will, have informed your practice as an LGBTQ pagan. And if you're finding value in this show today, we ask you to please consider sharing this with others that you know who share our path and share our common interests, and the goal of building bridges and creating a collective, a meaningful collective that crosses those lines in the sands that between our various traditions, especially within our LGBTQ community. By the way, I think that this is a good time for me to announce that in future shows, I've made the decision in my life in general that LGBTQ, unless I'm using it for a hashtag, feels cumbersome, and I am going to refer to our community as queer. Because there are, I recently learned like 5 other initials that go after the Q, and homie, don't play that. So I'll stick with queer from this point on, and I use pagan, mindful of the fact that pagan is a completely different thing from witchcraft. Paganism and witchcraft are different things that have lines of intersection, and that when we use the word pagan, we just mean in general anything that is of or based on the old religions, the old spiritual paths, animism and magic. So so I just want to make sure that folks understand that in future installments. I'll probably put that on the website when we put up the archives, so that folks understand that queer includes everybody, pagan includes everybody. And that part of who and what we are as a community here and as a program is believing that everyone has the right to call themselves whatever it is that they are, so long as that is consistent with their behavior. And so if somebody wants to be part of this, this effort, this movement, this show, then they're welcome to be part of it. It's really that simple. And having said that, Richard, I certainly appreciate your decision to be part of this conversation today, and I look forward to you being part of future conversations as well. Every time that you've watched a broadcast, your insight and the things you shared have really stimulated a lot of thought and conversation for all of us. So thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it. And folks, if you're watching for the first time, we're glad you did. Share this with somebody that you know. And as we like to say at the end of every broadcast, I encourage you that no matter where you are, no matter what you're doing, and where life takes you, I encourage you to return to the present moment. The present moment is where the power is. Be grateful for everything that you've got, because if you can't be grateful with what you have right now, there is absolutely no reason to believe you'll be any happier with more. And always remember, the best is yet to come. This is Dr. Gianmichael Salvato for The Brew. I will be back next week at Wednesday at 3 o'clock Eastern time, and hopefully with my co-host with me for the show. And we will look forward to seeing you guys soon. Take care. Namaste, everybody.